Hey YouTube, what's up? This is going to be another tabletop video. I'm going to be comparing two service rifles from the Second World War, both of which saw extensive action. That would be the Russian Mosin Nagant model 1891/30 and the German Kar98K. And I'm going to be comparing the features of both rifles and which may, in my opinion, have had the edge over the other. I'm going to go through a number of characteristics. The camera angle will change throughout this video. I'm going to show you close up of the rifles and some of the accessories. Right, before we get started, there's that. Right, first off, brief historic discussion on both the rifles. First rifle here is the Russian Mosin Nagant model 1891-30. Now, these are very popular rifles in the shooting community at the present day, and this design dates all the way back to 1891, when the Russians were looking to replace the Berdan 1 and Berdan 2 single-shot bolt action and falling block rifles they had back in that day. They basically got slaughtered by the Turkish, who were using Winchester repeating rifles, so they thought it's probably time that we developed our own repeating rifle. That's where the Mosin came about. It's a combination of features between Russian arms designer Sergei Ivanovich Mosin and a Belgian designer known as Leon Nagant. Leon Nagant also designed the model 1895 Nagant gas seal revolver, which became the standard issue sidearm for the Russian military at that time. Mosin Nagant saw its first action in 1904 to 1905, that was during the Russo-Japanese War, and then of course the First World War and the Revolution in 1917, then followed by the Civil War after that, and its single largest use was definitely the Second World War on the Eastern Front, being used against the Axis powers. And it continued on after that, as a matter of fact. It was also used as a sniper rifle, continued to be produced to about 1965. Total production numbers are thought to be around 37 million. That was produced from 1891 to 1965. Second World War alone, there are around 17 million, I think, were produced in the Second World War alone. That's quite a staggering number. It was the most produced weapon in the Soviet arsenal at the time, and it was a standard rifle that everyone was equipped with. The second rifle we'll be looking at is the German Mauser Kar98K, which is the rifle that was used by the German forces during World War II, and would have gone head-to-head with the Mosin Nagant on the Eastern Front. The K98 model was actually derived from the earlier Kar98A and Kar98B carbine models, which came from the WWII 98, which was the much longer rifle of this, first developed in 1898 and used in the First World War. This rifle came about in 1935, and it was kind of the final development of the Mauser 98 system. It was a shortened overall rifle. This is what the Germans considered carbine length. They cut down the barrel length, and they also curved the bolt handle down to make it easier to manipulate. Talk about that later. This rifle served with distinction in the Second World War on all fronts that the Germans were involved in, and it also saw quite a presence in many subsequent wars, including the Six-Day War and the Arab-Israeli War of 1948, where it was used a lot by Israeli forces. Today it's still used, it's very popular with the shooting community because it's a very nice shooting rifle. There's a hell of a lot of history to it, and it comes from a very long rifle with very long legacy, right back to 1898 and the earlier Mauser models as well. First subject to talk about is the philosophy behind the design of both rifles. Starting with the Mosin then. The Mosin was designed from the ground up to be simply a rifleman's rifle. That was the point of it. It's got a long sight radius, long barrel, good weight to it, and it wasn't really designed for, say, artillery crews, mortar crews, things like that. During the 1930s and the Second World War, they did make carbine variants, and as early as 1907 they actually had a Cossack cavalry carbine, which was designed for, obviously, cavalry. And the M38 model, which came up in 1938, was roughly around the same dimensions. The barrel was a lot shorter, comes off here somewhere. And the sights were only graduated up to 1,000 metres instead of 2,000. So that was like a cut down rifle. That was designed to be used by artillery crews, mortar crews, anyone that didn't actually need a full length rifle. But as for this, the model 1891-30, which was the standard full-length rifle, this was meant to be used by infantry, and that was the purpose of it from the ground up. So it was a true rifleman's rifle was the subject behind it. The K98 is in a similar fashion. The Germans didn't, unlike the Russians, the Germans never sort of caught on with the idea in the Second World War of using long rifles and carbine-length rifles. They just had, instead of having a very short barrel and a very long barrel, they just had roughly a mid-length. Similar as the British did with the Lee Enfield, the SMLE and the No. 4, they were basically just sort of a mid-length rifle. But this is what Germans considered to be carbine length. And the Germans were very much into, fast-paced shoot and move tactics on the ground. So the K98, being that it's a shorter length and it's much easier to handle than the original Gewehr 98, it was designed to also just be simply a rifleman's rifle. A lot of features on this rifle were simplified from the original full-length model. It was just meant to be more soldier-friendly. So in the same aspect of the Mosin, but on slightly different terms, it was also just the standard kind of rifle that was used by infantry, although the Germans decided that, unlike the Russians, they just wanted one length of rifle instead of having a long rifle and a carbine length. As far as dimensions go, the overall length of the Mosin Nagant M9130 is 48.5 inches with a barrel length of 29 inches, versus the Mauser K98K, overall length of 43.7 inches and a barrel length of 24.2 inches. Due to the Mosin's longer barrel, it comes out ever so slightly longer than the Mosin, but there's no real huge difference. The weight of the Mosin Nagant is actually slightly more, on average, of that than the Mauser K98. It comes at around 8.8 pounds, and the Mauser K98 comes at around 8.2 to 9 pounds. The weight can vary due to some rifles of the K98, also the earlier ones would have the solid walnut stock just like this one, and the later ones would have the laminated. Both the Mosin and the Mauser design utilise the very commonly seen manual turn bolt mechanism, more simply known as bolt action. I use the K98K to demonstrate. You lift up the bolt, which unlocks it, retract it to the rear, exposing the magazine. Both the rifles hold 5 rounds of ammunition. You simply insert your rounds, and then you would close the bolt and fire the rounds off. Between each firing, you would cycle the bolt. Both of the rifles use that system. In that respect, they do work slightly differently, but in that respect they're very similar. Taking a closer look at the Mauser action, it's probably the most famous and most widespread and copied bolt action system in the world. The 1898 Mauser system is probably the most successful mechanism out of all the bolt action rifles, due to just simply how robust and perfected the design is. Almost every aspect of safety, reliability, strength, etc. was built into this rifle. In 1898 they didn't even bother to add further improvements to the action right up to the end of its service, because there was nothing to really perfect. It just was the perfected action of the Mauser. The rifle is a cock on open, just as most actions were back in the day. There were some which are known as cock on close. To demonstrate what that means, back here you'll see this is the striker. It's currently in the uncocked position. The bolt will cock the striker upon lifting it. There's a cam surface at the back which cocks it. You'll see it come out. There it is there, protruding out. That rifle is now cocked. Pulling the trigger then releases the striker force, which then sends the firing pin igniting the primer and discharging the round. The Mauser action also has a ton of safety features built into it. Right here we can see there is a gas shield. The idea is that if anything, any gases sort of escaped and there was a case rupture, etc., and it went back down the bolt, it would just deflect it off the side instead of going back in your eye and hurting you. The Mauser was also one of the first and earliest rifles to actually utilise the clip system. I think the Belgians actually used it first, but the Mauser 1898, the Gewehr 98 rifle, which was the perfected Mauser, so to speak, which used this action, it was one of the first rifles to utilise the clip system. The clip is simply a piece of stainless spring steel. It's just a piece of steel with another piece of spring steel inside which holds the rounds together. You can simply slide off like so. You can see there the spring steel inside, which puts pressure on the rims to hold them in place. To load a Mauser, it's very similar to most other rifles of the time. You simply open the action, insert the clip and push down. You can then either push the bolt forward or you can just remove the clip. Another feature of the Mauser bolt which made it so successful, and another feature which was also incorporated into many subsequent designs which used the Mauser system, is the controlled feed. What this means is when you open the bolt, as with all rifles, you have an extractor here which grabs hold of the rim of the case, which pulls it from the chamber. The extractor itself though, it protrudes right to the front and it's fully on the side. It's a whole separate piece instead of just being a little part on the front as you would have with the Lee-Enfield bolt. Good thing with the Mauser is when you have your bolt all the way to the rear and your cartridge is laid on top, as soon as the bolt gets to about this position, it's already caught the rim of the cartridge. This gives you extra safeties, and if you ram a cartridge into the chamber and it won't go all the way in, with most rifles you would have to close it and then actually put it down and then lift it back up to be able to actually catch the rim of the cartridge. With a Mauser you don't need to do that. As soon as it's got to about there, it's caught it. So if you actually need to expel the round from the chamber because it's stuck, you can. As with most other rifles, if they did not have this controlled feed feature, you would be doing this and it would not be pulling the round, which would then be stuck, and you're trying to pull it out with your fingers or whatever when someone's actually, you know, bayonet rushing you, etc., and you're pretty much a dead man because you can't get that round out. They compensated for this in case there was, for some reason, a round jammed in the chamber. You can pull it straight out. Another good thing of the Mauser, which makes it so safe, is right here you have two large locking lugs on the face of the bolt. Until this point, most rifles just had them at the rear here. There's also a third lug here, so all in all, it has 1, 2, 3 lugs. This gives it very good strength, and the Mauser can be chambered in a number of different cartridges, and you know it will be safe to fire. The lugs rotate 90 degrees into recesses up in the chamber and in the back of the receiver. You can see the bolt turning. You close it down. That means it's locked. The Mosin Nagant rifle, on the other hand, is one of those rifles, those many rifles, that falls into the category of not having the Mauser controlled feed. When you lift the bolt, you simply would normally have the extractor, mine's removed, but normally it would be on the side here. Now you can push around all the way into the chamber and then retract the bolt, and the round would just be sat in there. To actually grab the round, you need to move the bolt the last bit of the way forward by closing it. That then grabs the rim, and then when you pull it back, then it will grab it. So once again, you could have that situation where you stick it in and then you can't get it out because it's stuck up in there. It's unlikely that would happen, but the Mosin does have a feature to accommodate if something like that does happen, but it deals with it in a slightly different way. Say if we load a cartridge now into the magazine, you push it up in there and say it got stuck. The good thing with the Mauser is, the Mosin, is you don't have it stuck under the feed lips. The feed lips to hold the cartridge in only go this far until the neck is up inside the chamber, so you can actually just lift it straight out. Right. This rifle has the octagonal breech. It's often incorrectly called a hex receiver, but these octagonal breeches are mainly more sought after by collectors because they're meant to be sort of more robust and just greater metal mass up there to house greater strength. As for the safety catches, in my opinion, the Mauser has a far superior safety catch system. A lot of Mauser clones will have a 2-position, but the Kar98K, along with the original 98 system, has a 3-position. The left here is the fire position. The safety can only be moved when the rifle is cocked. Vertically up, the rifle is on safe, but you can still work the action. And all the way right is considered extreme safe. The upright position is also the takedown position. The Mosin, on the other hand, in my opinion, has a god-awful safety. The safety is actually very poor. You have to pull back on the whole bolt against all that tension, turn it to the left and let it fall. At best, this isn't a reliable safety because if anything jolts it, it can just put it off safe. The Mauser definitely wins in the safety section. Both the Mosin and the Mauser bolts have very simple takedowns and removal. To remove the Mauser bolt, you need to make sure the safety is in the upright position, retract it to the rear and pull back on the little lever on the side which holds it in. The Mosin, on the other hand, is a hell of a lot easier. You simply just lift up on the action to the rear, squeeze the trigger, and it comes straight out. Neither of the Mauser nor Mosin bolts need to be taken down completely for basic field maintenance, but they only need to be disassembled about halfway just for basic cleaning. Starting with the Mauser bolt, make sure the safety is in the upright position. There's a little tab, or a little button, right here. You simply depress that and start unscrewing. When it comes all the way, it will simply just slide out, like so, exposing your firing pin. And that's about as far as you need to do. Just clean the edge of firing pin, make sure that's all done. You can disassemble all this further, but it's not really necessary for basic cleaning. The Mosin bolt, on the other hand, is also about as equally easy. You simply just decock it, and the whole underside piece and the bolt head simply rotates and comes straight out. There's only about 3 main components for the Mosin bolt for basic cleaning. That's about as far as you would need to take it down. To reassemble, it's very simple. Slide it back in place, make sure it's all lined up correctly, and you simply turn it back into the cock position to reassemble it. Mauser bolt, simply stick it in the back. Just keep turning until it stops. When it gets this far, it will require you to turn it more, then it will click in place. That means it's locked together. Now both your bolts are back together. Now look a little bit closer at the features of the actual bolts. Starting with the Mauser bolt. The Mauser bolt itself, it is a very perfected design. It's been copied countless times. Now, the bolt body is mainly just one segment, unlike the Mosin Nagant bolt. Mauser has 3 locking lugs. You have 1 at the back, as per most rifles, and 2 at the front. This gives you a lot of extra strength. Of course, have the control feed on the side. The Mosin, often accused, like I said, of being more complicated than necessary, as it seems to break down into multiple pieces along the whole length of the bolt. It screams late 1800s, and as do both of these bolts, but this action is still used in a modified form on tons of modern military and hunting rifles, because it's generally the most reliable and the safest. I think overall the Mauser is a far superior design to the Mosin as far as the action goes. Reinserting the bolts is an absolute piece of cake. The Mauser simply just goes in. Once you pushed it all the way forward, you just want to take it off safe. You can then either dry fire or simply hold down the trigger, decock it slowly. The Mosin is even simpler. Simply hold down the trigger, slide it straight in. Click it once, pull the trigger. Both of these rifles are extremely durable, and they'll take a hell of a lot of abuse and throwing around, being dropped, smacked against walls or people or whatever in battle. As superior as the Mauser action may be, the Mosin action is also considered, and the Mosin rifle in general, is also considered to be one of the best rifles for winter conditions. One of the best bolt action rifles for winter conditions, because basically everything about it was designed to be used in wintry conditions. I mean, quite obvious why. It was being used by the Russian military, and the Russian winters are very freezing. Sub-zero temperatures are extremely common in Russian winter, particularly back in the winter of 42 and 43, which were some of the coldest winters for decades on record. In snowy conditions, most troops actually just ran their rifles completely dry to prevent the oil sort of freezing up and jamming the action. A lot of people panic when they retract the Mosin bolt and actually see how loose the tolerances are. It was deliberately done in that way, and the whole thing's just rickety. It was deliberately done in that way, as with most Russian weapons, because they have very loose tolerances and they're designed to take a lot of grime, ice, snow, etc. and they'll have that extra space between everything. Another feature that makes it a lot easier to use in the snow is the fact that it has a straight bolt handle as opposed to a curved one, so it's very easy to grab with mittens or gloves. The trigger guard is also extra large. It's a lot easier to get your finger in there if you're wearing mittens. And because the bolt handle has a very predominant ball and it's straight, it's a lot easier to grab than trying to put big fat mittens around a ball which is just off the surface of the wood, as with the Mauser. So it's a hell of a lot easier with gloves just to grab that. Do a very brief demonstration of the ergonomics of the rifle. The Mosin sling, for a start, is attached underneath just like most rifles, so it carries on your back like so. It's easy to get off quick and get straight on target. The good thing about where they put the finger groove on this rifle right here, so for your fingers, is when you have it on your back, as soon as you're carrying it, as soon as you reach for the rifle, your hand just naturally goes to that finger groove. So then you can just pull the top of the sling and you pull it straight off, and then you're straight on target. I find the Mosin quite good just for point and shoot, so if you have the front sight about the same level as your eye, as soon as you see something, you can just go up and get it. As far as the bolt goes, it's not the easiest to use from the shoulder, mainly because it's not curved down. Whenever you're sort of using it from the shoulder, it is a little awkward, and it just doesn't feel as natural doing it from up there. It's probably not as it's definitely not as easy as something like a Mauser or an Enfield. I do definitely though, however, prefer the ergonomics and the overall balance of the Kar98 over the Mosin. One of the main reasons is simply this: if I hold it straight in the middle, it balances perfectly. So it's very comfortable if you hold it there, not after you've just fired a load of clips, because it'd be like touching a hot kettle, but you can just carry it like that down by your side. The sling, although I don't have a sling for this, is actually attached to the left side of the rifle. So when you have it on your back, the whole left side of the rifle is completely flat. So it's very comfortable to have that side touching your back, essentially. And this would be obviously above your shoulder where the sling's attached. Good thing with the Mauser as well is because it has a turn down bolt handle, it's a lot easier to actually use from the shoulder, because you're not having to sort of unnaturally turn your arm to grab that, and you have a tendency with the Mosin to sort of bring it down, as I showed. But with the Mauser you can be on target and just go, and obviously from the hip it's just as easy as well. The Mauser also is very comfortable to aim, because you can hold it either down here with this portion, or you have this whole, heat shield handguard wood up here, where it's actually very comfortable in either position. Because the rifle is balanced in the middle, you don't feel like you're carrying a lot of weight out front. I mean, the thing with the Kar98, it's so easy just to, when you're out, to know even from the shoulder, because you can't push the bolt forward on a empty chamber because the floor plate will stop the bolt. So that easily lets you know you're out of ammo. You can then bring it down and immediately see, and you can go to your pouch, pull out your clip, stick it straight in there and push it straight down. So it's very ideal. Great rifle. Mosin and the Mauser both have rear sights graduated up to 2,000 meters. Simply slide up, there's a little button on the side to press that, and you have the numbers on top from 1 to 20, that's 100 to 2,000 meters, and you just slide that up to wherever you want and adjust your aim accordingly. This is a rough view down the Mosin Nagant sights. The sights are currently set on 100 meters, and now we have them set on 1,000 meters. Raising the rear sight just makes you adjust your aim accordingly to compensate for the bullet drop. If we compare that to the K98, which in my opinion has slightly better sights, we can raise that from 100, sliding the sight up, and causes us to change our point of aim for longer distances. The Mosin bayonet is, just from the blade length, exceptionally longer than the K98 bayonet. It comes out right about there. Although this is probably more practical generally because it has a much stronger attachment point, it's easy to fit on. You can also use it as a fighting knife, obviously. The Czech and the Yugoslavian Mausers use the same exact type bayonet, except they would have a muzzle ring and their own independent markings on the blade or either on the hilt somewhere. Mosin bayonets were generally the same. The M44 bayonet, which was the side folding bayonet, attached via like a swinging pin on the side of the rifle, so you could just swing it 180 degrees out. The overall blade on the M44 bayonet though was slightly shorter. The Mauser bayonet is more of the conventional type, slides over the cleaning rod. You can either just push it down or you can hold the button, which makes it easier, and it slides straight on. Locks in nice and tight. First you would normally remove your scabbard, like so, but to remove the bayonet, it simply unclips from the left side of the lug by pushing in this button. You can then just pull it straight off. Mosin Nagant bayonet is more of the traditional type. It's basically a socket type. Simply slide it in with the top part of the bayonet directly in front of the front sight. Twist it clockwise and it goes straight on. To remove the bayonet, simply depress this, twist it. Some of them are quite tight, including mine, but most of them do fit. When the bayonet is attached, the rifle is extremely long from muzzle to butt. This gives you increased length of reach over your opponent. It's much longer in total profile when it has the bayonet attached than the Mauser K98 with the bayonet attached, so in theory you can stab him before he stabs you. But still, this bayonet served well enough, although it does add an extreme amount of length to the rifle, which is why when the Russians developed the M38 they decided to produce the M44 as well, which was basically a carbine length rifle with a side folding bayonet just like this but slightly shorter. So it was an overall shorter rifle than the full length 9130 like this with the bayonet, which is very cumbersome and difficult for house-to-house fighting for obvious reasons. K98 with the bayonet on the other hand is a much more reasonable length. It's not sticking out massively, the rifle is still quite short, and even from this distance I can almost get it in the camera. The bayonet is 10 inches long, so that adds that's all it is, an extra 10 inches to the rifle since the rest of it's underneath the muzzle. So it doesn't really add a hell of a lot of weight to the rifle either. You can feel the difference when you're aiming it, but it's not significantly front heavier, you know, like the Mosin with the bayonet is on. Trying to aim with a Mosin with the bayonet is, for any length of time, offhand, it's quite a challenge because it does add a lot of extra weight to the rifle just because of the size of the bayonet. K98 bayonet overall is just much better as it can also be used as a fighting knife. You can simply pull it off and just use it like that, or you can slide it over and use it on your rifle. So overall I just think it's a slightly more reasonable size. Onto the ammunition. On the left we have the Mosin Nagant cartridge, which is the 7.62 by 54R. On the right we have the 7.92 by 57mm IS cartridge for the Mauser K98. I believe both started off as round nose projectiles, and in the 1900s they were converted to obviously the Spitzer design, which means pointed bullet. The 8mm Mauser generally both these rounds will have muzzle velocities around the 27-2800 mark. And it can vary, obviously depends on what rounds you're using. Sometimes it may be higher, sometimes it may be lower. Both these rounds will excel out to 2,000 yards easily, although it's not effective in man-sized targets at that distance, obviously. But it's mainly just as far as the shooter is capable of hitting a target. It mainly relies on his personal ability. These rounds will easily strike a man-sized target at 1,000 yards with an experienced shooter. Mausers and Mosins that were scoped rifles, there are kills in World War II that were reported out to near about those ranges. The 7.60 by 54R on the left dates right back to 1891, And it was originally used in the M91 long rifle Mosin, and it's been used in many of the Russian weapons right up to the present day. As was the 8mm Mauser, it was used in pretty much all the German rifles of World War I and World War II. The Germans did have the MP44, which used a cut-down version called the 7.92 Kurz, which is generally classed as an intermediate round. Both of these rounds are classed as full-powered rifle cartridges, and both of them still see a fair bit of use today. Another thing I thought would be briefly interesting to bring up in this video is changes that were made to both of these rifles throughout the Second World War. These kind of changes were inspired by trying to make the rifles quicker to produce, and particularly from 1943 onwards, when the Germans sort of declared a state of total war and all their factories were switching towards making rifles and other small arms for the war effort. As for the Russian Mosin Nagant, which I think I'll start with, not a lot was really changed on the Mosin. You have slightly different receiver variations. In 1935 to 1936 they quit making the octagonal breech up here, and then they switched to just the round receiver like most rifles would be. They also switched to making high wall receivers here, with there was a portion on the side which was not cut out. The overall quality of the finish, particularly Ishevsk examples, there were two factories making these. There was Ishevsk and Tula. This one is a Tula example. But most of the Ishevsk ones from about 1941 to 42 onwards were coming out quite scruffy. And there are a lot of lathe marks, machining marks all over the receiver, and the actual finish wasn't generally quite as good, because they were just trying to get rifles out the door in a hurry. Kar98K, on the other hand, did have a lot of features changed about it. This is a 1937 example, made at Oberndorf, so that's the original Mauser factory. It's also not a Russian capture, so it's in completely original condition. It's got all the capture screws, all the original Nazi markings are still on it. One of the things that they incorporated on the early Mausers is they had this flat style butt plate just like this. It didn't have an extended side. And the reason they changed that is because when they started making rifles with laminated stocks, which are cheaper to make than a solid walnut stock like this, they were worried about the stock splitting in melee combat, or just from being dropped on its stock. So they made an extended butt plate which sort of came up to around the side. So they had a slightly different butt plate during the mid to late war period. From about 1942 to 43 onwards, they really started to rush the K98, and they started making stamped steel components for many of the rifles. For example, the barrel bands. This rifle has the H band. It resembles a H shape, so that's why it's a machine part. They didn't bother machining the H out of it. They just made it a single round band with nothing, just a single band. So it wasn't very sort of intricate and well made. They were just trying to get rifles out the door. Another thing they changed in the K98 was they did add sight hoods from about 1939 onwards. Some of the rifles that were made before 39 were modified if they went back to an armoury for repair or maintenance or whatever. They had a little cutout on the front sight so you could get a front sight protector and slide it on. There was a variant of the K98K that partially started production in 1944, I think. It was known as the Kriegsmodell, which is basically translates from German as war model. They just made everything super cheap. Most of the non-vital components like barrel bands and floor plates and etc. were all made of stamped steel, so they were cheap. They obviously didn't have the H band, and some of the rifles were so cheap they didn't even put the cleaning rod or the bayonet lug on them. Although I think for simplicity the Mosin definitely wins, because it's just simply a no bells and whistles rifle. If you have an earlier Soviet-made 9130, you'll most likely get a lot more interesting, breech markings. For example, mine has got a whole load of Cyrillic lettering all over the breech, which most of the later ones didn't. They would typically just have a date and a factory or the Soviet star just stamped on it somewhere. As for the K98s, the Germans were quite obsessed with putting German markings on almost every single piece, which if you disassemble a K98, you will work that out pretty quickly. But other than that, you've just got the basic sort of the Waffenamt eagles, and the Germans usually used factory codes because they did everything in code because they didn't want the Allies to know exactly where they were making weapons. So they tried to keep it fairly secret where all the guns were coming from. About 1943 onwards, the Germans were really competing for resources and materials, because they totally failed in taking parts of Russia they really wanted, which would be good for natural resources, etc. As for the K98 though, the quality and the fit and finish, same with the Mosin, both these rifles, the fit and finish did suffer as the war went on. Overall, the rifles were still very functional, even if they were a Kriegsmodell or a late war Mosin. I mean, they will still hit a man-sized target at a good old distance, and they were still reliable and they were still safe. But it's just, I think that the visual appearance just suffered slightly. Most of the rifles, if they went into repair, if something was broken, they'd chuck it off and replace it. It's very common to get rifles which are from a certain year, like say a pre-war, but they'll have features, late war features on them. They have just a complete mix-up of pre-war, mid to early, late war, etc. features on them, because they're just chucking all the pieces together from whatever they could find. My Mosin, on the other hand, being 1927 refurbished, this one is completely all matching parts throughout. It's all original parts. Even the stock is, I think, so I was happy to get that. I think what I will do, just before I conclude this video, is I will talk about some brief disadvantages of both rifles. The obvious one is they're both bolt action. So while at mid to long range engagements, masses of riflemen firing onto a target, it's great in that respect, but for CQB, close quarters combat, house to house clearance, things like that, these rifles are very long, especially the Mosin Nagant, because this rifle was definitely not built with house to house combat in mind. With the bayonet on, it's extremely long, although it does give you a supreme length of reach over most other rifles of the period. I think it was actually the second longest rifle and bayonet combo in the Second World War that was fielded. That was first place, I think, goes to the Japanese Arisaka, which is ridiculously long with the bayonet. Actually taller than most of the Japanese soldiers themselves. But that is the main disadvantage of both these rifles. They are bolt action, so your firepower is limited. If there were particular examples of both these rifles that were particularly accurate in factory testing, they'd often have their receivers drilled out and they'd be fitted with an optic. The K98 did have some options for a scope. The only disadvantage of the scope of the K98 is a lot of the German scopes were very well engineered and they actually needed a tool to adjust, so that's a slight disadvantage to the variants. But Mosin Nagant had the PE and the PU sort of 3.5 power scopes. They were a lot easier to adjust in the field. Mosin Nagant was a very good sniper rifle, but like I said, for close quarters combat, a submachine gun would definitely be more preferable. I mean, that's the obvious disadvantage of both of these rifles. Another disadvantage of the Mosin, I will say, is when it does have the bayonet on, it is quite front heavy. I think where most of the weight of the Mauser, as I showed you earlier, you hold it in the middle, it's perfectly balanced. When you have the bayonet on, it's not significantly adding more front weight, but as with the Mosin, it's not balanced in the same respect. It's more back heavy. It seems to want to turn back. So when you have the bayonet on, you would actually think that it would make it more level, but it actually doesn't in a way. It still makes it seem more front heavy, and it is quite exhausting to aim for extended periods. They are quite heavy. They're not like the lightweight aluminium constructed M4s of today. These are serious rifles. They're solid steel and solid wood. I wouldn't say that either of these rifles has a huge disadvantage about below the other, because they're both bolt action rifles. They both hold 5 rounds, so they've got the same magazine capacity. It's just what really you would prefer, and I'd say overall my choice, if I was in the middle of the Second World War and I had to choose out of these, that would be my choice, simply because it's in my opinion, it's just more usable, and it's only as long as it needs to be. I don't really think you need to have like a 29-inch barrel just for your standard rifle. Well, I do love the Mosin. It's definitely a very nice looking rifle, and they're both these rifles are fantastic pieces of history, so if you're into it, I suggest you go and pick them up. So on that note, I think I will say thank you very much for watching. It's been quite a long one. So that's been a look at the K98K and the Mosin Nagant, and I'll let you know when I have some more videos on the way. So thanks a lot for watching, guys. Peace out.